Hey guys, welcome to Capturing Christianity. My name is Cameron Bertuzzi. If you don't already know who I am, I'm exposing you to the intellectual side of Christian belief. And tonight, I'm hosting a live discussion between Dr. Josh Rasmussen, a very good friend of mine, and Scott Clifton, who is also a good friend of mine. You might know him as TBS. He's a former YouTuber. We'll get into introductions in a second. But tonight we're talking about the argument from Contingency. And specifically, we're asking, is it sound? Is the argument from Contingency a sound argument, a good argument?
Persuasive.
Or persuasive. There you go. Sorry, I have the title wrong. We're talking about whether or not it's persuasive. Anyway, so if you want to learn more about the intellectual side of Christianity or Christian belief, and you want to discover arguments and evidence that you didn't even know existed, then make sure to subscribe to our channel and turn on the little bell so you don't miss any of our videos. All right, so let me just introduce my guest real quick. Dr. Josh Rasmussen has been on the show a bunch. He's had conversations with several atheists over the years, including Dr. Graham Oppy and Tom Jump. Both of those discussions are available at the link in the description of the video. Josh is an associate professor of philosophy at Azusa Pacific University. His area of expertise is in analytic metaphysics with a focus on the foundations of existence and the philosophy of mind. He's the author of Defending the Correspondence Theory of Truth, Necessary Existence, co-authored with Alex Pruss, The Bridge of Reason, and How Reason Can Lead to God. All of these books are incredible. He's also a born-again Christian and a very close friend of mine. So my other guest tonight is Scott Clifton, and you're going to see both of these guys in just a second. You may know him, like I said, as TBS. Scott Clifton is an Emmy Award-winning actor, best known for his work in daytime television, including General Hospital, One Life to Live, and The Bold and the Beautiful. He's a non-believer with he actually wrote Causal, but it's casual, but lifelong interest in philosophy. I'm just going to call you out on that one. Clifton gained notoriety for his YouTube channel, Theoretical Bullshit, where he discussed popular arguments for and against the existence of God. That's the reason why he's on the channel, and other topics. So he dabbles in philosophy of religion, and he's a big player here. You may not know about him because he doesn't really post a whole lot of stuff nowadays, but back in the day, like 10 years ago, you were like a big deal in this world. So he lives in Los Angeles.
Still a big deal in this world.
Oh, yeah, he is. Yeah. Yeah, extremely. He lives in Los Angeles, California with his wife, Nikki, and their son, Ford, which is an awesome name. He's a constant irritant to those around him. I don't know why he included that.
I got to write my own bio, okay? If you're going to let me write my own bio, then that's what you do.
All right, let me pull up the discussion scene so people can actually see you guys' faces. Okay, so, well, now everyone can see you. And so here's a little personal anecdote about Scott. Years ago, when I first learned who he was, which is as I got my introduction into apologetics and stuff, I was prepared to kind of like write him off as another like online atheist that didn't really take or bother to read or understand the views that he was criticizing. And all it took was one conversation with him to realize that he's not that kind of person. He's not that kind of atheist. I learned very quickly that Scott can back up his claims with precision. He's articulate, clever, and funny. So, and he's over the years, I guess we're friends. Are we?
We're totally friends.
Totally friends.
Totally
okay.
friends.
Okay, there you go.
Thanks, man.
So
that was like really nice. Wow.
Well, no, it's true. I mean, yeah. After our first conversation, I was like, wait a second. This guy is like a serious person. He's like a serious. He seems to have actually looked at the arguments a lot more seriously than I initially gave him credit for, or was going to give him credit for. But anyways, yeah, it was awesome, and I think that was on Facebook on the Reasonable Faith Facebook page.
That's
what I'm referencing.
I was thinking it was like it had something to do with Reasonable Faith. Is where I first met you. That's so funny.
Yeah. So if you're new to Capturing Christianity, I host discussions like this about once a month or so, pretty much on anything relating to God's existence. And all of our past discussions are available at the playlist in the description of the video. And I should also mention that today marks 1 week that I was laid off of work. And so fortunately, my wife and I were prepared for this, and we're even expecting it to happen. And we decided sort of as a family that when it did happen, I would pursue full-time ministry with Capturing Christianity. And so my goal is to be at 100% support by the start of 2020. Right now, we're sitting at 53%. So if you value the work that I do and you want to help, then I want you to pray and consider and think about becoming a patron on our Patreon account. And the link to that is in the description. But when I say pray about it, I like really mean pray about it. If you're a Christian and you want to support a ministry or whatever, like, yeah, just pray about it. Think about it. I want you to pray about and seek God about supporting me. All right. Link to all that is in the description. If you want to learn more about this announcement, by the way, if you want to learn more about the reasons why I want to go full-time and why I think it's important and what full-time is going to look like, then I posted an announcement video on Monday with all the information that you need. The link to that is in the description of the video. All right. So with that out of the way, pretty fast. We don't take a whole lot of time for introductions here. We're going to jump right into the discussion. And I'm kind of going to let it go to you guys. Let me just give you the basic outline of how it's going to go tonight. And then we'll just, we'll go from there. So tonight we're talking about the argument from contingency. And since Josh is like the expert here, right? And I think, Scott, you're completely okay with this. We're going to let Josh just kind of like take us into the waters and kind of take us where he wants to go. And then we're both going to just interact and all of us have a good conversation about this. And we're going to do that for about an hour and a half, and then we're going to do Q&A. And I'll tell you more about Q&A once we get closer to it. But Josh, yeah, take it away.
Sure. So I was just telling Scott before the break, or before, I guess, during the break, that I have this picture of a table with some pieces that we can put on the table and kind of just look at the pieces together and analyze the board position and kind of see what we can discover together. And I really want to look at this with fresh eyes and not just kind of like defend a prior position, because I think that's going to lead to the most productive conversation. So, and also I want to kind of echo what you were saying, Cameron. I had a conversation briefly with Scott on Facebook, and that one conversation was enough for me to have a similar feeling that, oh, this is a serious thinker, and we could have a very productive conversation together. So, so that's kind of the frame for the conversation.
He's blushing. How many times can we get him to blush tonight?
Oh no, a lot.
So yeah, so I have a prediction that we're gonna have a productive conversation. So we'll see how this goes. And so as far as the argument from contingency, this is an argument, I think of it as a tool to investigate the kind of the structure of reality. And what I see is at stake is a structure of reality in which there's a kind of causal order or explanatory order. And maybe a sort of simple statement of the argument. I'll just give you a simple statement, and then I'll turn it over to you, Scott, and we can start just to think about the argument. So we can sort of think of the argument as an inference to the best explanation of contingent things. So contingent thing would be something like this, that it exists, but it's not sort of automatically actual. It's not automatically in existence. And so you might wonder why there are these contingent things if they're not automatically actual. And so one thought is that the best explanation of something is going to be better than no explanation, sort of other things being equal. And if that's right, then the best explanation of contingent things, of all of them, is going to be better than no explanation, other things being equal. And then if you think about what could be the best explanation of contingent things, all of them, well, to avoid circularity, it's not going to be one of the contingent things. So this is going to take us to something that is not contingent, but is instead automatically actual and foundational. And this foundational thing could then provide a kind of ultimate explanation of reality, because we could see, okay, why is there reality? Well, because there's this sort of foundational thing that exists in a robust way. It provides the ultimate explanation for things that are contingent things. And so,
Scott,
yeah.
Do you want to come back on that, or I was actually going to ask you Josh, to clarify some of the terms, because we're already like going straight in.
Yeah, I jumped too fast.
It'd be helpful to just sort of define what we mean by contingency and like foundational, and sort of the basic terms that we're going to be using throughout the conversation.
Yeah. So a definition of a contingent thing would be something that can not exist. Another way of putting this is that it's not automatically actual or automatically in existence. And an example would be, well, this cup could be created, could be destroyed, it can fail to be, and so it would count as contingent. And then a foundational thing would be something that exists but doesn't depend for its existence on other things.
Cool. So okay, before I get too far into the content, just as a proviso, I guess, to this conversation. I want to say a couple of things. One is that, I mean, anybody watching this is going to notice the like super obvious asymmetry to this conversation. I'm a high school dropout, literally. And so this is a privilege for me to get to be here and to have a live real-time dialogue with a professional philosopher. And I want to say that I was the one who asked if we could retitle this conversation, "Is the argument from contingency persuasive?" instead of "Is it sound?" Because this is, Cameron and I have talked about this a little bit, and this is one of Cameron's favorite arguments. I don't know if you would say, I know you would say it's your favorite argument. I don't know if you would say if it's the most defensible, but it's really high up on your list, and I know that. And we talked about like us maybe having a conversation, but the fact that Josh was available like really was a game changer. And I just, at first you talked about it, Cameron, as if it was a debate, and I was the one going, no, can we please, can we not talk about this as if it's a debate? Because that's just a waste. I mean, I would be crazy not to view this as an opportunity to learn something. And so for anybody who maybe agrees with me or is watching this and expecting me to like take on the Christian that's not going to happen. I hope to ask intelligent questions. I hope to come away from this with a better understanding of an argument that I pretty much I don't understand as well as other arguments. And so this is, anyway, I just want to say that this is an opportunity for me. So please don't be disappointed if I'm not, debating, because I don't want to do that. Josh, everything you said was like super cool. Thank you for this. And so where do we go from here? So I have a little bit of trouble with the idea of a necessary being. I don't know if that's the place we should start, because that's kind of the conclusion of the argument, or at least a phase of the conclusion, as far as I understand it. But that's something that I'm hoping to pick your brain about, is what is a necessary being exactly? What makes a necessary being a necessary being? The differences between like being uncaused and on one hand, and then existing in all possible worlds on the other. And you'll explain the modal logic part of that, or the modality part of that. But that's something I'm really interested in.
I noticed that Josh kind of avoided using the language of necessity. Yeah, I don't know if that was on purpose.
Well, I automatically actual. It's because that term necessary is open to so much interpretation. And I think I've noticed more after teaching just how confusing it is. I remember I would teach these classes, use all these examples, and then after all that, students would be asking, okay, are you saying it's like a chair that's necessary for sitting on? It's sort of like a functional necessity. And I realized, okay, that term is just so confusing. Plantinga has a book called The Nature of Necessity, which is really helpful for teasing out different kinds of necessity. And Scott, one of the questions you asked me on Facebook was about Swinburne's objection to a necessary being. Right. But then it's interesting because even Swinburne thinks that God has a kind of necessity to God, a kind of factual necessity. And so, there's all these sort of grades of necessity. And so, your question is a really good question. I mean, it's maybe one of the hard questions because there are different accounts of necessity. And I think what I want to do in sort of opening the argument is maybe even leave it open as we can, and make an argument, because there's a kind of argument structure. If you think of the argument as a tool for investigating rather than as a tool for debating or defending a prior view, you can think of the argument as sort of revealing a kind of structure of reasoning. And the structure of reasoning would be something like this. Here are some things that exist. Let's say cups and chairs, and then you wonder, why do they exist? And then we look to the best explanation of their existence. Well, whatever explains cups and chairs is not going to just be one of the cups and one of the chairs, because that's circular. So there's got to be something beyond the cups and chairs, right? And so we use that same kind of reasoning to think about sort of contingent reality, where we maybe even can leave it vague in the beginning, what contingency really means. And then this will get us to a kind of non-contingent source of contingent reality. And then we can maybe tighten our understanding of, okay, what is the nature of this necessity?
Yeah.
Yeah, I don't know if you want
Yeah,
to.
that sounds good to me. I'm pretty much, and this is probably obnoxious, but I'm on board all the way up until you get to, I think, a necessary being. And so for me, my job is to figure out what assumptions I'm making that make that difficult. So yeah, you have a collection of stuff, and I know that there's differences in, talking about facts versus talking about
Hmm.
things.
Hmm.
And I know that is going to matter, even if it doesn't seem like it matters now. But yeah, I'm on board with saying, that a thing that exists, or even a collection of things that exists, require an explanation, and you don't want to use that thing to explain itself. That's circular,
Hmm.
so that doesn't work. But then at a certain point, once you get, that concentric circle gets bigger and bigger and bigger, and you get to, like, the whole of material reality, whatever that may be.
Yeah.
That's where my intuitions completely break down about
Hmm.
this, and I stopped sharing the intuition that, space and time itself has
Hmm.
a cause, or an explanation. And part of why my intuitions break down about this, and I remember saying this even when I was younger with, like, my Christian friends and whatnot, that Christian friends who were obviously into apologetics and reading apologetic books and had a vocabulary for that kind of thing, that I if I were a Christian, if I were a theist, I think I would believe that God's existence is a brute fact,
Hmm.
not necessary in the sense of, has to exist. It
Hmm.
doesn't seem to say that something, either has to exist or can't fail to exist or exists in all possible worlds. I, I don't know what could possibly be making that the case
Hmm.
about a being like God. And it doesn't seem actually a problem from where I'm sitting for Christian theism to take the what I now know to be the Swinburne sort of view that,
Hmm.
yeah, God exists, but that doesn't mean that God necessarily, no pun intended, exists in all possible worlds. It seems to
Hmm.
me that it would be perfectly consistent to say that, for any world, where God does exist, God exists at all temporal points in that world, but that there are some possible worlds where God has always existed, and there are also possible worlds where God has never existed, and I can conceive of both. And so it's hard for me to get on the train of God being a necessary being. Why does God have to exist is where I get stuck.
Yeah. Well, and this goes back to the question, what does it mean to have to exist?
Right.
So maybe it would be helpful to kind of get a little more precision on some different definitions. So one notion of have to, where I think we're going to agree, is certainty. So it's a kind of logical certainty, like 2 + 2 has to equal 4. And when you see those numbers added up, you see that you're certain that it equals 4. There's a kind of certainty to it, right?
Right.
And then the question is there even a what you might call epistemically possible world, or a world in which we could sort of conceive of there being no God, right? And here we might just agree that, okay, yeah, you don't have to be certain. God's existence is not certain, right, to everybody. That would be too strong. In fact, I was actually thinking it might be helpful to think of necessity as coming in degrees of strength, and then maybe we have a dial. And if you take it all the way to the maximum, then the kind of necessity is that it's in all physically possible worlds, all metaphysically possible worlds, all
Right.
epistemically possible worlds, all logically. And so that's the maximal degree of necessity. And I think you and I and Swinburne will all agree that nothing is necessary in that sense. That's too
Right.
strong.
Right. Right.
Right. So then the question is, if we turn that dial back, yeah, actually, maybe we can explore it this way. So we can start with agreement that there's a degree of necessity that's too strong, and there's also a degree that's maybe too weak. Maybe we'll find an agreement there, and then we'll explore like how far we can turn the dial, right? So
Yeah.
um,
You used the
yeah.
word, earlier, not just now, but before.
Mhm.
You used the word factual necessity, which I take. Please correct me if I'm wrong. I take that to mean something more like, um, my parents are factually necessary given my existence. Is that
Well,
is that a thing?
that is a thing, but factual necessity here more has to do with it doesn't come to be or cease to be. And Richard would say, Swinburne would
Oh,
say, it actually cannot come to be or cease to be.
right. I would agree
Um,
with that too if I were a theist.
yeah, but I mean, but even a non-theist or a naturalist might think that matter or energy cannot come to be or cease to be. And I mean, in principle, there could be overlap
So,
here.
factual necessity really isn't about possible worlds, no matter what the strength of that modality. It's really just about existing at all temporal
Yes,
points in a given possible world.
yes,
Okay. Okay. All
yeah.
right. So maybe that's not okay. Then that's not going to be a point of contention, and that's not something we're going to disagree
Yeah.
talk
Right.
about. Okay.
So it looks like there might be some. So this is I like this way of approaching it because it looks like we can have overlap if we turn the dial too weak, factual necessity, we can agree there. If we turn it
Right.
too strong, kind of epistemic certainty, that's too strong.
Right.
And so now the question is, okay, if there's a kind of foundational layer of reality, what is its nature? And I was using this term of being automatically actual. I don't know if you would be happy with that, that it would
Let
have.
me make one clarification here too that might be helpful, is because right now what we're doing is we're talking about stage one of the argument from contingency. So we haven't gotten to the point where we're like, what kind of other properties does this thing have? So right
Right.
now, for example, Graham Oppie agrees with this whole first section of the argument. He'll say, yeah, there is something necessary, but that isn't God, is what that's basically his response. And so he agrees, and I think this shows that there's progress happening in philosophy religion, is that stage one is looking more and more enticing to some, at least certain atheists that are working in the field. And so I just wanted to make that clarification though between this, we're right now we're just talking about stage one of the argument where we're looking at like, is there a necessary, some kind of foundational layer of reality? And then stage two looks at that nature more deeply and starts to analyze what kind of other properties it has. Does it have any divine properties like omniscience and omnipotence or whatever else, you know? So
Right.
I think that's helpful. Right now, what we're just talking about is stage one.
Yeah. I mean, I'm no Graham Oppie, but I don't see. I don't. In my intuition is that I don't even think the universe itself is necessary. That doesn't seem plausible to me. That doesn't seem like I need to think that in order for other things I think to work. It seems I can imagine possible worlds with no universe or something that exists that's different from a universe, or a universe with different properties than the properties it has. The universe seems to me. Let's assume that. Let's just assume, for the sake of argument, that the universe has a first moment in time. You know, that the universe has a beginning. You may notice I'm avoiding the phrase like popping into existence or coming into existence. That feels misleading to me because it assumes time where there wouldn't be time. But let's say that the universe has a first moment in time. The universe has a beginning. Um, it's in the, all of our intuitions about causes and explanations and all of that is kind of grounded in the world that we experience around us. And when you get to that level, you're just talking about, I mean, just the reality works differently from the way that our primate brains are used to kind of seeing and experiencing things. And I don't find, I mean, we're faced with a bunch of like, not really palatable options here. And I think I find the idea that the universe is just a brute fact plausible. And I think a lot of theists have an issue with that intuition, me having
Yeah.
that intuition.
I said I want to just really affirm the kind of epistemic humility here, because when you're thinking about the sort of ultimate causes of things
Right.
or the beginning of time, I think it is helpful to kind of admit when we don't know, or to kind of have a stance of curiosity and exploration. One thing that I've personally found helpful is just sort of connect my reasoning about ordinary things, or even in science, with using the same structure of reasoning to think about reality as a whole. So let me just make a cluster of points, then you can interact here.
Yeah.
So first, it seems like I can at least see some things about ultimate reality. So for example, I can see that ultimate reality isn't contradictory. Okay. And that might sound kind of obvious, but it's actually not trivial that, okay, well, there are no contradictions anywhere in reality like that. There are no
Right.
contradictions at the beginning of reality. There's no contradictions over on Mars, right? Or under the soil of Jupiter where we haven't explored, right? There's no contradictions there. So we can maybe see some things, okay? And then also in science, we seem to rely on this principle of explanation, where other things being equal, the best explanation is going to be preferred to no explanation, especially if there is an explanation available, right? So maybe we can conceive that there's no explanation of genetic similarity. You know, like maybe genetic similarity, I don't want to use the word pop into being from nothing.
Sorry.
Okay. but
I take your
probably,
point. Yeah.
but let's say that the best explanation is some kind of common ancestry. Okay. Then I would take it that explanation is going to be better than no explanation. It seems in the case of that, precisely because we have an available explanation, right? And so my thought is we can proceed humbly and carefully, and we can bring onto the table maybe one bit of evidence, namely a kind of inference to the best explanation of contingent things. And then to avoid circularity, we're going to have something that exists in a more robust way at the foundation, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
And that leaves open, because I like what you said, that you can conceive of other worlds in which there's just nothing, right? And I want to really affirm that, and, you know, that, and that's consistent with using this inference to the best explanation. Like we could conceive that there's no explanation of genetic similarity, but it might be that what's conceivable there isn't really what's most probable. Does that?
Yeah.
I don't know if that helps kind of take us a step forward. Or...
Yeah, it does. So what we're really after here, I mean, what kind of all of this is about is explanations. We want explanations. We have a hunger for explanations. We want to live in a world where explanations are available. So maybe it'd be just interesting to talk about how necessary existence is an explanation, because I'm just as hungry for explanations as you are. But when someone says, okay, why does the world exist? Well, the world exists because, this is not the argument, but casually speaking, why does the world exist? Because God explains the world. Okay, what explains God's existence?
Right.
Well, his necessity. You lose me there. I don't understand how that actually, because it seems to, okay, so, God doesn't have the property of existence, right? We kind of want to stay away from that, right? Like the whole, like we're certainly not defining God into existence. We're saying that if God exists, God has this property of necessary existence, but he only has this property if he exists. So we're not begging the question, right? We're being careful. But if he only has this property of necessary existence if he exists, that doesn't seem like an explanation of his existence in the first place, because his existence has to obtain prior to the properties of that existence obtaining. Does that make sense?
Totally.
So I'd like to actually jump in here real quick if I can. So this is something that Josh and I have talked about at length, is this idea of, okay, so like things that when we're thinking about when something doesn't have an explanation, I think we're trying to figure out what is it about something, whether it be a mug, whether it be anything. How do we know when something doesn't have an explanation?
Like,
right?
What makes it different? What makes it relevantly different from the things that have an explanation?
Right.
Yeah, exactly. And so I think what you're pointing out, Scott, is that like necessity isn't the thing that makes it the case that something doesn't have an explanation. Or maybe I don't know if that's what you're getting at. Or you're thinking that like,
or he might be. I think, Scott, what you're saying is necessity isn't an explanation.
Yeah, or at least it's not a satisfying explanation. I understand that its job is to be an explanation, but
Yeah.
I don't feel like I understand God's existence any better from being told that his existence is necessary, especially when his existence is only necessary given his existence. It would be like, if I'm walking out of the supermarket and I'm walking to my car and I notice a dent in my car and I'm looking for an explanation of that dent, and then I noticed that there was this runaway shopping cart. I would go, oh, okay, well, the runaway shopping cart explains the dent in my car. But if somebody else came along and said, no, 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 your car wouldn't have the dent in your car
Could not have not been.
yeah,
It's just
no,
necessary.
or no, just that the dent in your car um, is what explains the runaway shopping cart. And that to me seems so. It's like saying that the shopping cart could not have been a runaway shopping cart unless there was a dent in my car, just as God's existence couldn't be necessary unless God exists. That's why it fails to be an explanation to me.
Yeah. Okay. So let me just see if we can sort out a few. There's a cluster of things on the table here.
Yeah,
So
yeah.
this is really good. This is very helpful. So one way that I think of the question of explanation is I think about what is it that sort of calls out for an explanation. Now it might be that there are many different things that call out for an explanation. Like, it might be that if there's like a dent in your car, why does that call out for an explanation? I mean, that could have just snapped into being from nothing with no explanation, right? but it seems like probably not. One thing you could say sort of minimally is that dent is like other things that we in our own experience see have an explanation. So maybe you've actually seen somebody dent a car, right? But then we can go a little deeper and try to tease out a deeper principle, like, well, what is this relevant similarity between things that have an explanation? And here again, it might be that there are many different features, but it might be that one feature is that it's, I'm going to use this phrase again, not automatically actual. Like it could have not been actual, but it is actual. So why is it actual rather than not actual?
Right.
And
right.
the very fact that it's actual rather than not, and it could have been not actual, your mind just might feel like, there just needs to be an explanation. Now, that doesn't mean that your mind is right? I mean, your mind feels like there can't be contradictions, right? But
Yeah.
I mean, if unless we have some principled reason to distrust our mind, some sort of special reason to distrust it, the very sense that it calls for explanation might itself be a kind of evidence that there's a deeper explanation. So what I'm thinking here minimally is that things that are not automatically actual sort of call for an explanation in a special way, precisely because they could have not been actual but are actual. So why are they actual rather than not? Whereas something that has a necessary existence, it doesn't call for an explanation for that same reason. Now, I think what Cameron was pointing to is that you might still wonder why a necessary thing would be actual. I mean, you might still wonder about that.
Yeah.
And maybe we can go deeper in, like maybe this takes us into stage 2 where we start thinking, okay, well, if the foundation of reality has a supreme nature, that would sort of maybe explain why it has a robust, automatically actual nature, because if it were less than robust, it would be less than supreme. And so its supremacy, its supremeness sort of explains its necessity. Now that's not going to explain yet why there's a contingent reality. So to do that, we're going to have to tell more of a story about how this supreme foundation causes a contingent reality. So I've just manipulated a lot of pieces here. So
Yeah.
Help
so I'm going to make an observation and then I'm going to ask you a question. So saying that when I hear that God's supremeness explains God's necessity in some way, that's kind of what you were hinting at.
At least it predicts it, but maybe explains it.
Yeah, to me, that sounds like saying that the dent in my car is what explains the runaway shopping cart. It sounds backwards to me because I take necessary existence to be what most Christian philosophers would call it a great making property, right? It makes God great, or in this case, it makes God supreme. And if it is making God supreme, then it feels circular to say that God's supremeness is making him necessary. So
Yeah.
my question for you is, um, do you take it to be a coherent question if I were to ask something like, what fact of the matter makes it the case that God's existence is necessary? Is that a coherent question to ask?
It strikes me as coherent. I mean, it does seem to me that the supreme nature could explain the necessity. However, it's not really required for the argument to a necessary foundation, because maybe what you would want to say is that there is no further explanation. Once you bottom out at the necessary
Yeah.
thing, there's no further explanation.
Yeah, I
And so
think
the
that's what I would.
necessity, yeah, because and I actually want to affirm this, because to be honest, I'm never really quite sure which way is more plausible in my own mind. So one thing I think sometimes is, well, I'll use the term God. God exists because God cannot not exist. Okay. But sometimes I think, well, maybe it's because God cannot not exist that there's no explanation for God's existence, right? So it's precisely because it's automatically actual that there's no sort of call for further explanation. And I almost wonder if maybe that's what you're pointing to.
I mean, maybe like I would find it satisfying to hear that God's existence is just a brute fact, but that I think concedes more than the Christian might be comfortable with in most cases,
Well, I'm happy to be
because
uncomfortable.
well, yeah, I mean, so is Swinburne, apparently. But
Yeah, I think
uh,
ultimately, and this is something that Josh does, is well, Josh, you have a couple different versions of the argument from contingency. And one of those versions that we've talked about in our 4-part podcast series, which I have linked in the description if you guys want more of the contingency argument. We had a 4-part series on our podcast. You can go listen to it right now. Well, one of the versions that you gave was, it wasn't necessarily based on like the contingency part of it. It was more about dependence, right? And we talked about like, there's got to be, if you take all of reality, if it includes God, if it doesn't include God, all of reality, there can't be an outside explanation of everything that exists. And so there's got to be some level of bruteness to all of reality, right? And so I think that anybody, the totality of reality, there can't be an outside explanation. And so I think that deductively you can show that everybody, literally everybody, has to be okay with some level, some kind of bruteness about reality.
And then the question is what kind of reality is sort of most qualified to be brute or ultimate without a further explanation? And so then my thought is that contingent things, it seems like they're not most qualified because we can conceive of a further explanation of contingent things.
In your book, Is God the Best Explanation of Things? I know that there was one part where you, and this was like super helpful for me, where you, I think it was a section called choosing a causal principle. And you gave 3 kind of candidates for a causal principle, and you kind of went through them all and said, well, this might work, but it doesn't because of this, and you could respond with this. And so the first one was something like, for any contingent fact, it has an explanation. And then the second was the second one was, well, how about for any contingent thing, it has an explanation. And then the third one was something like, for any fact about the existence of contingent things, there's an explanation. And I don't think I read far enough, but it sounded like that was the one you were going to settle on. And
yeah, so just to clarify, that this was in my article, The Cosmological Arguments from Contingency. And in that article, I was sort of laying some possibilities and kind of showing strengths and weaknesses. And yeah, no, you summarized that very well. And in that particular article, I was sort of the least critical of that third principle.
Right.
And I think that third principle is true. So.
Right. Okay. Yeah. So can we try to map that principle onto God's existence?
Explain. Say the principle one more time, because I wasn't following along.
Josh, you'll probably say it better than I would. Do you want to?
So I've got all these principles in my mind. I can't quite but I think it's something like, for any contingent x's, there's an explanation of those of their existence. So that would be at least that would be a good version of the principle. We can work with that one.
I printed it out.
I do think that's true. So for any cups, there's an explanation of those cups. For any stars, there's an explanation of those stars. For any set of contingent universes, if they are contingent, then there's an explanation of their existence. And and then from there we infer that the explanation isn't among the very things being explained, and so isn't itself contingent.
It was, I found it. It was every contingent fact concerning the existence of contingent things has an explanation.
Okay, yeah. In my more recent work, I like, here's, I think, a better formulation. So,
okay.
Just for any contingent things, there is an explanation of their existence, which I think is equivalent to that, but maybe
isn't
we
that
can...
the second one, though?
What was my second one? I don't remember.
The second one had to do with things.
I've
the
got
first one
all
had to
these
do with
paths
facts.
winding in my mind, and I can't keep them straight.
Oh no, I see.
There's many paths to truth.
Yeah. The second one was every contingent concrete thing has a cause of its existence.
Yeah, see, that's a hard one because there might be an infinite regress.
Right.
And so how do you? Yeah.
Right. Okay. So, we've but this is a contingent thing, and it would be.
See, brute contingency seems worse than brute necessity. Doesn't it to you? I mean, if you have something that's just automatically actual, I mean, because you talk about like a dent in your vehicle, that didn't have to be there. Like,
right.
Right. And so it calls for explanation. Like, how did it get there? But imagine instead, and put God to the side, because God's sometimes distracting. Think of energy, okay? Energy. Let's imagine energy just automatically actual. Could not be in some robust sense. And now maybe the problem is sort of your mind tells you that, well, matter could not be, like it had a beginning, right? But if you could imagine some sort of ultimate thing, maybe you can't picture it, right? Maybe it's more like the law of non-contradiction. It's more conceptual in its nature, more mind-like maybe.
Yeah.
And I mean, it's almost like what I want to say is, in the same way that nothing can be both green and not green, if there's this foundational thing that's automatically actual, it can't be non-existence, and it has this firm grip on existence. And then if that's right, I sort of lose the feeling that it has to have a deeper explanation. At least it doesn't seem to call out for an explanation in the same way as that dent does.
Is that, wait, are you, when you say you lose the feeling of it calling out for a further explanation, in your mind, is that a bad thing or is that neutral?
Well, it would be, it's neutral. I mean, this isn't an uncomfortable thing because I already have an independent well, even if it were uncomfortable, reason forces me by what Cameron was saying. To recognize that there's got to be some sort of ultimate that has no further explanation. So the question is, what's the nature of that ultimate? And my thought is that if that ultimate were merely contingent, then there would be sort of this feeling that there could be a deeper explanation in terms of something that's not contingent.
So
do you see what I mean?
Yes, but I'm worried about. I know you're not, but I'm not.
I don't want to make you uncomfortable.
No. This is all great. I'm worried about using contingent in different ways, and then conflating different. So in one sense, contingent seems to imply having been caused. Dependence, right.
Yeah.
I don't think not existing in all possible worlds has to mean dependence, because God to me seems like a being that is not dependent and yet does not exist in all possible worlds.
Totally with you. Yeah.
So
some notion of possible.
Right. Yeah, exactly. So if I were a theist, that would be my view of God, because there doesn't seem to be any fact of the matter that explains why God would exist in some possible worlds and not others. That would just have to be a brute fact of a given possible world. And yet that doesn't seem like a problem to me. And
I think I think that you guys are actually closer than you think, Scott, because going back to Josh's original conversation about the dial, like he might agree that God doesn't exist in every possible world if we're talking about like epistemically possible world.
Possibility. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. So you guys might be more in agreement than you realize.
Well, then maybe the question is what understanding of possibility do we want to get to? Because that might make the difference.
So here's something that might be interesting, and this might pull us farther apart. But let me just paint a picture of reality. So on this picture of reality, you and I are reasoning, and some of our reasoning tracks what we might call the rules of reason. So, for example, the law of non-contradiction, nothing can be both true and not true at the same time. You could have the thought that the law of non-contradiction is true, and if you did, that thought would correspond to this rule of reality. Somebody else could have a different thought. They might think, no, the law of non-contradiction is not true. And, there's some philosophers think that. If that rule of reality actually obtains, then that would explain how it is that people can have true logical thoughts versus false logical thoughts. Okay, right. So what I'm setting up here is a picture of reality that includes what I like to call a logical landscape, which is comprised of rules of reality that are logical rules of reality. Okay, and this logical landscape isn't merely stuck in your head. Because if your head were eliminated, which would be very sad, it would still be true that there are no contradictions, right? So the idea is that our thoughts that are logical thoughts correspond to a logical reality, and that this logical reality has this kind of firm necessity, maybe not epistemic necessity in the sense that you have to see it, because people see different things, but a kind of ontological necessity in the sense that it has to be there. Like the rules of logic have to be there. And if that's right, then that would fit really well with this argument from contingency that's pointing us to a foundational layer, because if the rules of reason or the rules of logic have to be there, then those rules of logic could fit into the foundation of existence as a necessary, automatically actual, firm reality. And so what I'm trying to do is sort of paint a picture that, and I know this is contentious, but I mean it's one that I've come to kind of slowly over time. It's sort of grown on me that reason and logic. I mean, there's our reasoning, which is fallible, but then there's this like perfect reasoning, which is like the principles of logic. Right. And they don't wait for us. It's not like logic is true on Tuesday and then goes false on Wednesday. It's like logic is just firm, and that really makes sense if logic is built into the fabric of the foundation. So that when somebody who doesn't believe in God is thinking well, okay, they're actually following tracks of reason within the fabric of the foundation, and that's a beautiful thing, right? You don't even have to know that the foundation is supreme to be in alignment with its nature to some degree. Okay, so that's a picture. Tell me what you think of that, or how you might push back.
So please tell me if what I'm about to say betrays that I didn't understand you, because it may. I feel like I vaguely.
I'm going to take back every nice thing that I said about you, Scott.
I'm sorry.
Help me to clarify, because I covered a lot there.
So logic, funnily, may be not a great example in my case, because I'm not sure I think that logic or rules of logic is something weaved into the fabric of reality. It's not something that we have discovered empirically. I think that logic you never get a. I have a 3-year-old who's trying to get in here. Contradictions exist in statements. They don't exist in rocks, or clocks. And so it seems to me that the rules of inference, the law of non-contradiction, excluded middle, identity, those really just apply to language and statements. And it's a way for us to keep our statements about the world consistent with themselves. But I'm not sure in terms of I don't think there's like this ontological logic that is binding I think the universe just is what it is and isn't what it isn't. But then you might say, aha, right there, that is what I'm talking about.
Yes, exactly. Well,
So
this is why I'm actually arguing for the reality of logic, not depending on what you're thinking or even what you write down. Like, even if somebody erased all the chalkboards and burned all the books,
yeah,
still nothing can be both true and not true. Or the law of identity, that for anything that does exist, it would be itself and not something else. And
right.
that would characterize reality. You might say it characterizes the natures of things, and that those natures are logical natures. And
Yeah,
that
a statement can be
yeah.
true even if no one believes that it's true or thinks that it's true.
Yeah, we're all on that.
Okay.
So just
Yeah,
very briefly, there's like three different data points or arguments that point, in my mind, to the same result, that reality includes a kind of logical landscape. One is from the nature of truth, that you can have a true logical thought, and truth is about correspondence with reality.
right.
So if a true logical thought corresponds with a reality, what is the reality it corresponds with? Well, it's got to be a kind of logical reality. It's got to be something. And it's not a material reality, because you could have a true thought about things that don't materially exist. For example, you could have the true thought that if there were 5 unicorns, there would be more than 3 unicorns. And somebody else could have the thought that if there were 5 unicorns, there would not be more than 3 unicorns. One of those thoughts is true because it corresponds with reality. The other is not true, fails to correspond with reality. What is this reality? Well, it's not material. It's not unicorns. It's a kind of abstract reality. So
So
that's
okay,
one argument. Yeah.
right. So okay, let me play with that for a
Yeah.
minute
Yeah.
because
Do it.
this is me totally spitballing. So I may get halfway through a sentence and go, nope, never mind, I hate this. Um, Imagine, like you said, as some philosophers think, that there were a dialetheia. There were real world
Uh,
contradictions. You know, there's a rock that is both a rock and not a rock. I don't know. Let's say we lived in that kind of world. Um, Given my intuition that logic really is about tracking statements and keeping statements in line with one another, I think you could still be illogical in that world. I think you could still say, you know, that the premise one, you know, the rock is a rock, both a rock and not a rock.
All right, so we're back. Apologize about the technical difficulties. I have no idea what's going on. I'm just looking at my little green light here and it went to red, and so hopefully we're back and we're good. But yeah, so while we were breaking just now trying to figure out this technical difficulty, Josh said something that was apparently really interesting that Scott wanted to address. Do you want to address that, or what do you want to do, Scott?
Okay, sure. Let's have fun.
we're in the weeds now.
Yeah, I know. We're totally not talking about like contingency anymore, but well, maybe
Well,
in
no,
some sense.
it's related for sure. 'Cause it's
Yeah,
about
yeah.
the nature of the necessity.
Right. Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. But okay, so I was kind of playing with this idea that because I have this intuition that the logic really
It's about statement.
is about statements, not necessarily reality. It's not like something we observe empirically. I was saying, well, for fun, I could imagine a possible world where, ugh, and here I am stuck using possible world semantics about a world in which logic doesn't. None of this is making sense. But go with me on it. I can imagine a world in which, you know, dialetheia really exists. True contradictions exist, not just in statements, but in the world. Like there is a rock that is both a rock and not a rock, you know, or a tree that is both deciduous and not deciduous, and so on and so forth. And I could still imagine, even if we lived in that world where real contradictions obtained, we could make invalid inferences about that world. We could still use poor logic about a world in which contradictions actually obtain. And then, Josh, your reply was to say, well, but yeah, exactly. But that's because we do live in a world where logic describes the world.
I take it that you don't think that our world is one of these worlds where rocks are not
Exactly.
not
No.
rocks.
Yeah, no, I do not. No, I don't think that dialetheia are real. I don't think that true contradictions exist. But I'm using this as a thought experiment to sort of separate logic as describing the universe or the world versus logic applying to statements. And I think I think the logic does. We can only talk about the world through statements. That's all we have. It's the only filter that exists. And so, uh-oh, Josh, on my end, froze.
Yeah, he does look frozen for me too.
He looks.
So
He also looks like really high right
he
now.
looks super stoned. There
All
he
right.
is. He's back.
Hey, he's back.
You
Okay,
look
yeah,
really
so
stoned for a second.
it's because I couldn't, but the computer was not showing you guys for a minute. But
Yeah.
Yes,
yeah,
you're
okay,
back.
so this is good, and I hope it's okay, Cameron, for us to take a few further steps into this territory, because this is about a certain kind of necessity that could characterize the fabric of the foundation. And I want to just look a little bit more closely at statements, because I think there's something right about your intuitions here, which is that when we're talking about logic, we're talking about statements. And but now we can ask, okay, what are statements? Okay, so think about, for example, the statement that for any x, x is x. Okay, we could call this the law of identity. Right now, there's that statement in your mind, and then there's that statement in my mind. Okay, and maybe there's that statement written out on some different chalkboards.
Right.
Okay, but if your mind were removed and my mind were removed, and all those chalkboards were removed, wouldn't it still be the case? Wouldn't it still hold that? I mean, even if you can conceive of these other realms where logic doesn't hold, you and I agree that our world isn't this way.
Right.
And
We do.
and so here's an explanation for how it is that we're able to even talk about logic. It's that our thoughts and our statements have what's called content. Sometimes philosophers call this propositional content, right?
Yeah.
And that the propositional content transcends the particular ink on a page or pixels on a screen. When the screen refreshes, that propositional content still holds, right? Still holds that whatever exists is itself and not something else. Does that make sense, or is this?
Yes.
Yeah.
So do you know? I think you know Alex Malpass, right?
Yes. Yeah. We've
So
had a conversation on this.
yeah. I think I saw that. So Alex, I was having a conversation with Alex, and he was trying to get me to see, and he was, uh,
He was
I
almost succeeding.
I was being super recalcitrant, but he was
Okay.
trying to get me to see that that statements are necessary things. They
Well,
may not be
statements have, yeah, they have
that they
these
exist.
propositional contents. So just to make sure we're clear here, there's a difference between a ink on a page and then what
Yes.
the ink on a page means,
Right.
what
Right.
it means, right? That's how you can translate across languages. The same thing can be represented with different ink and different symbols, but it's the same thing.
Right.
And that's
Yeah.
what he was trying to say is the thing. Philosophers sometimes call these propositions. Propositions are the meanings of the sentences, and those things
Yes.
exist, and they're automatically actual.
Right. And so
At
yeah, so
least if
he
they're
was
at least if they're necessarily true, they're necessarily existent.
exactly. And so
Yeah.
he kept pressing me on this and going, "What do you think? In what sense can a proposition have a relationship to the world if you think it's fictional, if it doesn't actually exist? I mean, propositions exist, and I was having so much trouble with that, and I think one of the reasons I had trouble with that was because I wasn't at that time. I was worried about the implications of that because I wasn't separating concrete versus abstract
Mhm.
entities. And I think I see that you don't have to make the jump from necessarily existing
That's
abstract
right.
propositions
But that is a
to
big point of progress to recognize the necessary existence of abstracta, because
yeah,
that then is a necessary reality. And that does fit nicely with an argument from contingency, because if we want the best explanation as being better than no explanation of contingent things, then we can understand that a concrete necessary thing could include within its nature the abstract necessary landscape, and that gives us a simpler, more unified vision
yeah.
of reality.
Well, let me propose one r- to me super relevant difference between an abstract necessary thing like a proposition and a concrete necessary thing like a god or um, if somebody asks me, I can actually, it's not a nonsense question. It's a question I can actually answer. If somebody says, why is it true? Why is it necessarily true that 2 + 2 = 4? I can actually answer that. I can say because its denial literally entails nonsense. And so 2 + 2 = 4 has to be true. There is actually a fact about the world that is making 2 + 2 = 4 necessarily true.
Mm-hmm.
I can't find a way to apply that to a concrete necessary being like God.
Mm-hmm.
There's nothing there to do the work of I mean, we know that God does not exist as a proposition is not self-contradictory. It's not nonsense. And I know we're not even talking about that level of necessity necessarily, but I can't find anything that is doing the work of making it the case that God can't not exist.
Okay, so let me jump in here. And I think that this is actually a good place to segue into stage 2, just to talk about it for about 20 minutes.
Oh, no. Okay.
Yeah. Well, let me do this first, because we are going to do Q&A, and I'm pulling this up here, the screen. So we're going to do a Patreon-only Q&A with Josh and Scott. If you want to be part of that, if you want to ask them questions and be part of the live Q&A that's happening for this discussion, then check the link in the description. We're going to be doing that about 5 minutes after we end this stream, and we're ending this stream at around 9:30 Central. That's in about 20 minutes from now. So yeah, if you want to be part of that, check the link in the description. You can sign up now. We're going to have a little, like I said, we're going to have about a 5-minute break in between. So yeah, so let's try to segue if we can to talk about stage 2. And I think the reason why I'm segueing here, Josh, is because I think that you're going to be able to address his concern here, going back to your supreme foundation theory. Or maybe I'm wrong, but I think that's one route that you could go there.
Yeah, so I mean, there's a cluster of interesting concepts here, right? But if you here's a hypothesis, okay, the foundation has a supreme nature, and then this hypothesis makes predictions. So one of the predictions would be that it has the properties that a supreme nature, that a supreme being would have, or supreme something would have. And so then if you think about sort of what are intuitively supreme making properties, knowledge, power, goodness. If you think of knowledge, you think of supreme knowledge, then you might think that it's got sort of supreme reasoning capacities, and that this is going to entail the perfect principles of reasoning, or those rules of reasoning, that those exist. And then, well, if we have independent arguments for thinking that there are these rules of reasoning that exist, then that would be a successful prediction. But this doesn't quite get to your concern. So your concern, Scott, is that there's a relevant difference between necessary abstracta and necessary concreta. And this is actually a concern that Richard Swinburne would express as well, although he's skeptical of even the necessity of abstracta. And in fact, it's interesting because one of his early arguments against the necessity of anything, this kind of strong necessity, was just what you said. You can't deduce a contradiction from saying that there's nothing. Right. But then I wrote this on my board in case this came up. So I'm looking over at my board. So this is what I shared with Richard in conversation. So I said, okay, so Richard, here's a statement. Nothing exists. Does that entail that nothing exists is true? And he said, yes. So there's this kind of T schema from Tarski that snow is white if and only if it's true that snow is white. And then I think you already kind of see where this is going.
Yeah.
If it's true, then that entails that something is true. And then if something is true, that entails that something exists. Therefore, nothing exists actually entails that something exists. And that's a contradiction.
This is exactly what Alex... This maneuver is exact. I don't mean maneuver pejoratively. It's a communication tool. Yeah, this is exactly what Alex used to get me to make the case to me that propositions exist. Necessarily.
Yeah.
And I concede I don't have a response to that.
And we might even be able to go further, because if you think about like what are propositions. Well, there are things that like point to things. Like the proposition that snow is white seems to be like pointing to snow. It's like about something, right? And this pointing property is sort of a characteristic property of like a thought or a thought-like thing. In fact, this is what Richard actually thinks. He thinks that sentences express thoughts. And so,
Right.
and so if that's right, then if you say something like, well, there are no thoughts, that's going to entail that it's true that there's no thoughts, which is going to entail that, that there's something that's true. But then what's this thing that's true? Well, it's a proposition. It's a thought-like thing. And so if that's right, there are no thoughts actually entails that there are thoughts, in which case it is actually a contradiction. But I want to affirm that the contradiction isn't explicit in the proposition that there are no thoughts. It has to be teased out by a sequence of inferences, and those inferences can go out of one's sight, which is why I don't think that any of this is like epistemically certain, because you actually have to follow the sequence to see.
Right.
And so this is why I think sometimes when people will say that, well, I can imagine a world in which there's no God, therefore there really could have been a world in which there's no God, I think that inference is too quick.
Right.
Because it requires, that you would be seeing all the possible chains of inferences. And I think it would be more proper to say, I just don't see it one way or the other at present, which I think is maybe the position that you're in. But then the argument from contingency could be an independent reason to think that even if you don't see a contradiction, that there is one, maybe by the light that I just traced.
Yeah, well, that's interesting. The idea that two propositions are actually contradictory in a way that is beyond our understanding or comprehension, or choose the noun that you want.
Sure.
That's something that
and when you say our, right, because I mean there's different people, right? I mean there are discoveries in mathematics that you couldn't really see, if it was contradictory or not. But then later, like how many prime numbers? Are there infinitely many, or is there a highest prime, right? And then that was sort of discovered, and there might be things that somebody has discovered through a pathway of reasoning that other people haven't seen, and it might even be that different people can see with different degrees of clarity something. So it might not even be certain, but it could be subtle.
Yeah. Okay. So let me try to do some kind of like super hasty, reckless reductio of that, and then you can shoot it down. The twin Earth thought experiment. Water is H2O, but what if it were, on twin Earth it's XYZ? And the idea there was basically that, even before we discovered that water was made up of H2O, it was still true that water was H2O. And so it still would have been the case that the proposition water is not H2O was a contradiction, even before we had actually made the empirical discovery. I personally don't buy that. And part of it is because I'm not, I guess it's called a semantic externalist. I don't think that statements mean more than what we intend for them to mean. And so let's do a counterexample. And I think that, the reason it would be...
I might be with you on that example, by the way. I might actually be with you because you mentioned empirical sight, but I actually think that you see the principles of logic through a kind of sight by reason. And I do think you can press buttons on a calculator and then use your eyeballs to sort of see a logical truth.
Yeah.
But I might share your skepticism of that kind of externalism.
Okay.
Actually.
Well, I'm trying to find a counterexample to, or a defeater, for the idea that there can be contradictions that we
don't see.
The two statements. Yeah, exactly. And so I imagine, and I think the reason that the twin Earth thought experiment is powerful is because we have the benefit of hindsight. Mm-hmm. And I think once you get rid of hindsight, and so let me present an alternative twin Earth thought experiment where we don't get hindsight. Consciousness, right? Mm-hmm. It's fundamentally a mystery. We don't know. We know if you and I are going to talk about consciousness, we know what we mean. We're not speaking gibberish. We can have meaningful conversations about consciousness. But it may, assuming that the hard problem of consciousness is, let's be optimistic and let's say it's not so hard of a problem. 40 years from now, we discover that consciousness is XYZ. Ontologically speaking, what consciousness is XYZ. On twin Earth, we discover that it's ABC, right? This would imply that somebody here who says it's ABC or on Twin Earth who says that it's XYZ is actually contradicting themselves. And my intuition is that they're not. They're just wrong.
Yeah,
And,
I might be with you on that example. But take another example. So think of an unproven conjecture in mathematics. So none of us see that it contradicts the sort of more basic principles of math or reason. Nobody sees it one way or the other, but it either is one way or the other.
right.
But we just don't yet see that. So that might be a better example. We might agree on that one.
But aren't we trying to find right now something that we would both agree is a contradiction that we just don't see?
Yeah. So the argument here is that an unproven conjecture is its truth is either going to contradict some more basic principle, or its falsity is going to contradict some more basic principle. If it's a conjecture in mathematics, let's say, and it's sort of a well-defined mathematical system. And so there are these unproven conjectures, and you might think that either its truth is going to be contradictory or its falsehood is going to be contradictory, but we don't yet see it. That's why it's not proven yet.
Oh, okay.
So that would be an example of something that's out of our sight, right? Yeah.
The problem here was that I was just not following you.
but you're following now, right? So we're
yeah.
So in about 2 minutes, we're going to need to move into closing thoughts for this section, and then we're going to go to Q&A. Yeah, it's super fast.
Okay.
So just giving just giving you guys a heads up.
I mean, so kind of big picture, kind of where we're at, where I sort of see us is we're sort of thinking about this big question, right? Like sort of what's the structure of reality? And I think there's a certain amount of alignment here that reality has a kind of causal explanatory structure. And then there's a question about, okay, is there a kind of foundational aspect of reality that exists in a way that doesn't call for further explanation? So it's relevantly different from dependent things. And then we're looking at, okay, well, if it has some kind of necessity, whether it's merely factual or metaphysical or logical, sort of how much necessity does it have? And so just for the spirit of fun and debate, I thought, well, let's turn it all the way to the kind of necessity that like logic has. And my argument was, well, logic, the principles of logic might fit right into the nature of this foundation. And that would explain some of these arguments for the reality of abstract logic, that it exists beyond our own thoughts of it, which it sounds like Alex might be kind of moving you in that direction, Alex Malpaz.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, obviously he's not like a theist, but he.
So there's nothing scary about this result then.
No. So, okay. So let me try now. We're talking about an argument for the existence of God or a supreme being or what is in essence a person that is responsible for everything that we see around us. And it sounds like I've been agreeing with you on everything that we. I mean, so it seems to me like. My intuition is that you can't, at a certain point, something is going to be brute. Mm-hmm. And I don't think that, however, as foundational as you can possibly get, that is going to end up being brute. And I have trouble with the leap from brute to necessity as in existing in all possible worlds. And you seemed fine with my having that intuition.
Depending on what you mean by possible. If it's just like a mere conceivable, then we're okay. We're together on that.
Yeah. So if you can have something that is brute, if you could say that, okay, well, maybe God is that brute thing. To me, that's not God existing of necessity anymore. That's just God happening to exist, which I don't find problematic for Christianity at all. Some Christians, I understand, would. But if we can make that move, then I hope I'm not.
You see it as a problem for the argument from contingency.
Well,
though.
So just to clarify, by brute, I don't mean contingent, or by brute, I just mean there's no further explanation. And my thought is that if it had a necessary nature, then it would be distinct from the kinds of things like the dent in your car
Yeah.
that would have a further explanation. That was kind of my thought.
But yeah, but I'm coming from the place of being dubious that necessary existence is any kind of explanation, because I don't think it's actually doing any explaining. It's not actually helping me understand why God exists instead of not existing. And so if we can go as far, maybe we haven't made it this far though in the conversation, but if we can say that, listen, there may be, God just exists. It may be possible that there are possible worlds where God doesn't exist and some where God does, but in the ones where God does exist, he obviously can't fail to exist. He exists at all temporal points in those possible worlds, and he is the brute foundation for all of reality. Well, if we can go at least that far, I don't see why we can't go that far with something like the universe. Now, that's unfortunately, that opens a whole can of worms, and I'm sure this is not an objection that's new to you, and you have plenty of responses to that. But so on the one hand, we have a kind of necessity or a kind of bruteness that applies just as well to the universe as not, and then on the other hand, we have a kind of necessity that could apply to God but not the universe, and that's the necessity that I don't think I buy. Is that
It totally makes
Okay.
sense. And I know, Cameron, we're getting at the end here. Maybe I can just offer
Yeah, go
something
for it.
that can maybe sort of even bring us together a little bit. Maybe it's helpful to not even think about this as an argument for God, but rather thinking about it kind of first as a kind of a tool to investigate the structure of reality. So let's just call the foundation of reality the foundation of the universe, right? And then we can begin to think together about, okay, what is this foundational layer like? Like, what could it be like? And so my thought is that, well, if it's merely contingent, like your dent, then we could conceive at least of a further explanation. And so a further explanation would be better than no explanation. So
Right.
that gives me some reason to think that it's not merely contingent like your dent, but instead has a sort of different kind of nature, maybe a kind of more robust nature, right? And then that's a bit of progress here, right? Because now we're saying something about the nature of the foundation. It still leaves open whether its robust nature is a consequence of it being supreme, right? So we can continue to go into stage two. But before we sort of leap ahead into these other doors and corridors, we can kind of celebrate a certain kind of, I think, progress. And because I feel like the word God is almost like a stumbling block sometimes to making
Yes.
this much progress.
So yeah, that was super clear and
That makes
helpful.
sense.
Where I would probably frustrate you is that I would want to take that foundation and put it back in the category of contingent things, because I don't see how it could be anything other than contingent. I mean, given that I don't see how anything could be necessary, I would want to just lump that right back, and then we're back to having no
Except for
underlying
abstract
foundation.
things, right? So you're kind of getting
Yeah,
more
I
over to
mean,
something. So as soon as you let something be necessary, and then especially if abstract things include propositions, which are thought like, now we're getting, I mean, maybe here's a diagnosis of what might be going on. When you're imagining a concrete reality, you're kind of thinking of it as material. And I think your intuition's telling you that no material thing would have this kind of robust necessity. It'd have to be more
Yes.
conceptual. Have to
Right.
be more conceptual like logic, which is kind of exactly what I'm thinking of when I think of God as sort of a supreme conceptual reality. Eh,
But you definitely don't see God as abstracta.
Not merely, right? But I would see abstracta as built into the fabric of this supreme mind, which isn't
Oh, sure.
material, right? Yeah.
Sure, but God is causally. I mean, the difference between
Has causal powers. Yes,
right,
but not
right.
like a proton or like a chunk of cheese, right? It would be more like maybe more like the nature of you when you reflect inwardly and see there I am. You don't see atoms swirling around. You just see a person who's thinking,
Yeah.
and maybe that sort of a reality wouldn't. I don't know. I'm
You're
just wondering if you're sort of imagining the kind of thing that's more material, and you're recognizing rightly that that material thing would have to be contingent. And if that's right, I mean, I would totally endorse that intuition. I have that
it's not
myself.
I'm not I promise I'm not conflating material and concrete.
Sure.
I
No.
totally can separate those two in my mind,
Yeah.
and I'm happy to grant non-material concrete entities.
Yeah.
And I'm still arguing,
Sure.
I think a non-material concrete entity. What's interesting about where we're landing right now, now that we're out of time, is that would probably be a perfect place to start stage 2, a conversation about
Yeah.
stage 2. And because I would go, okay, so this thing that I've granted you, I don't see how that could be a person, and then we go, we go
Perfect.
from there.
Yes.
And that would be awesome. Some other time, maybe.
The next episode.
Yeah.
The next episode. Well, Josh, you gave a pretty good summary of where everything's gone. So, Scott, did you want to add any?
If I hate to just talk too much here, but just because the topic was on whether the argument is persuasive, and we never really answered that question. And I actually want to just say right away that I don't think that it forces sight on anybody. At the same time, I do think that it can move people. It moved myself, and there is a website, necessarybeing.com, where I surveyed people who don't believe in a necessary being, and then I gave them arguments to see if they would find plausible premises in those arguments. And the majority of people who don't believe in a necessary being who took that survey have intuitions that entail that there is a necessary being, and some of them wrote me telling me that they were persuaded. So I do think it can be persuasive, but I don't think it forces people. So I think Scott, if Scott's not persuaded, Scott's supremely rational in his current lack of being persuaded.
So it's
maybe
resolved.
Not supremely, but
resolved. The argument from contingency is persuasive sometimes, at least sometimes. Yeah, just not to this guy, apparently, I guess.
Maybe stage 1 could be. Sounds like maybe.
Yeah.
I'm still not sure I buy. I mean, just it's pure intuition at this point, but I have a really hard time with talking about propositions as if they exist, like as if they are things that exist, even if we acknowledge that they're abstract. Alex is going to have to work on me more in that respect, but and maybe I need to hear from you more too. But yeah, but if I did grant that would get us somewhere. I mean, that would at least give us license to not feel silly talking about stage 2, because it gives us something to build off of. But I don't need to. By the way, Cameron, I think Josh has summarized beautifully, and I don't feel like I need to make a closing statement if that's cool.
Cool. Yeah. Well, let me just remind everyone we're about to move to the Patreon only Q&A with Josh and Scott, and so if you want to be part of that, check the link in the description. It links you directly to the post where you can gain access to the Q&A. And if you want to sign up, then you can actually gain early access to all of our content, not just this Q&A. And if you value what we're doing here, it doesn't matter if you're a Christian or an atheist. If you want to support me and this ministry, it means a lot. It's awesome that you would even consider it. So really appreciate it. And if you want to be part of it, check the description, like I said. And then for everyone else who just wanted to hang out and enjoy the conversation, I hope you enjoyed it. And anything else you guys want to leave with the audience? I've put links to both of your channels and stuff in the description, but is there anything else that you'd like to leave with the audience?
I'll just say that I'm really, really grateful, Josh, for your time, and Cameron to you as well for the same. This has been really, really fun, and I feel like I've learned a lot, and it's an opportunity that not a lot of people are afforded. So, thank you.
Thank you. Yeah, this was so much fun, and I think my prediction came out true. I felt like we at least made some progress in clarifying some of the landscape pieces there. So yeah, very cool.
Great.
Awesome. Well, we'll see you guys later. So until next time.